Welcome, everyone, to the Project Censored radio show. I just want to let folks know that we're recording this on Tuesday, January 14th. So please don't send me angry emails about how the situation in LA County has changed by the time you hear this. I'm aware. We're very glad this week to be joined by Lenya Quinn-Davidson, the Fire Network Director for the University of California Agriculture and Natural Resources, where she leads a statewide team working on various facets of fire resiliency, from wildland fire management and the built environment to workforce development and community capacity. Lenya, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I want to start with sort of defining what's happening here, because without naming and understanding what causes these fires, we can't really address them, as evidenced by this article from the Sacramento Bee way back in 2021, which is titled "Build, Burn, Build Again: Why is California Still Constructing Homes in Wildfire Red Zones?" And what this refers to are CAL FIRE zone maps that basically designate certain areas on their likelihood to burn. And it turns out that according to these 2021 maps, more than 2.7 million Californians live in, quote, very high fire hazard zones. About 350,000 live in towns and cities that sit completely or almost completely within those zones. And yet building continues in these areas. What's more, there doesn't seem to be much, if any, consideration on how to best address fire safety, whether that be cramming homes up against one another, poor landscaping choices, invasive plants that burn like eucalyptus, et cetera, et cetera. So, Lenya, I want to start here. Could you talk about conditions outside of the more obvious things like climate chaos that make what's happening in LA County so awful and so predictable?
Yeah, well, that's a great intro, and thanks for kind of grounding us in that reality. I think just to back up a little bit, I think it is important to recognize how much of California is at high risk of wildfire. Even our coastal areas, even our high mountains. I mean, there really is no part of California at this point that isn't vulnerable to wildfire. And so as attractive as it would be to say that people shouldn't live in these places or that these are not appropriate places to to be in California or to build homes, that's just really not the reality that we're living with these days. I think no matter where we live in California, we need to be thinking about fire, we need to be preparing for fire, and we need to be ready for the kinds of things that we're seeing in Los Angeles. I think the Los Angeles fires are they're definitely a unique brand of fire. We have different relationships with fire and different threats from wildfire depending on where we are in California. I live in Northern California on the North Coast, and a lot of the fires we have up here are more wildland fires, moving through forested areas, um, and burning in kind of natural vegetation. But the fires that we're seeing in Los Angeles are really these more urban wildfires, these wind-driven, ember-driven wildfires in urban environments that bring a whole host of additional challenges and really are kind of apples and oranges with some of the more forest fires that we see across the rest of the state. So certainly the confluence of extreme drought and the fact that Southern California has not had any precipitation really this fall and winter, layered with these extreme winds, and then the fact that you have millions and millions of people down there who might be causing ignitions and causing the like actually starting the fires. It's just kind of an untenable situation and really unfortunate confluence of events last week.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that really struck me about this, with like reading about this this confluence of issues, was that it seems that it's totally predictable, and yet there doesn't seem to be, like, I get that people need a place to live, but there doesn't seem to be any kind of preparation in terms of how we build our homes, or, even just the fact that homes are so packed together that there's like no space in between them. Could you talk a little bit about that issue? Like, okay, if we understand that this is something that's going to happen, especially as climate chaos ramps up, why are we not, or how could we be better preparing with how we build?
Yeah, no, that really is, I think, the central question is not do we relocate to other places or move out of California, but really how do we build better and become more adapted to fire? How do we learn to live with fire? And that's really a big piece of the work that I and my team do here in California with the university is really trying to bring a lot of these best management practices, these kind of recommendations that are really well studied and well understood, and how homes burn, how these fires move through these places, and bring them into policy. Make sure that as we rebuild in these areas that we're incorporating some of those principles because you're right. We often see that we rebuild after a disaster like this and we just rebuild in the same way that it looked before. And I think it's complex. There's a combination of kind of the psychology of the individual property owner or homeowner and thinking, well, this happened once, it's not likely to happen again. I see that a lot. Or this idea that, you know, um, they really want to live in a certain way. They want their home, they want their nice yard with their nice landscaping plants, or they want things like built in a certain way. And I totally understand that. I think there's a lot of when you have a loss like this, it's hard to think that you want to build in a totally different way because you're grieving too. So I think there's like a lot of complex psychology in that way. But then there's also this bigger framework of how cities plan, how do we lay out our communities, and moving forward, this is our reality. I mean, we're going to continue having these types of fires. This isn't the only example. We've had multiple fires like this in Southern California over recent decades, and in Northern California too. We had the Camp Fire that burned Paradise. We had the Carr Fire in Redding. We had fires in Sonoma County that all burned into urban areas. So again, like no one is safe from this, and there are really clear things that we should be doing.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about what like some of the things that you mentioned, the which seem like common sense things with regards to how people build and how things are structured. Could you share just a little bit about like what you and your team work on in terms of that?
Yeah, well, one of the concepts that's really relevant here is the idea of home hardening. And so this is, I guess just to back up, one of the primary ways that these urban fires operate and the way that homes burn in these situations is not from like a flaming front of the wildfire moving through a neighborhood. That's kind of what you picture when you think about a fire. You picture like the actual wildfire just moving, kind of in a linear fashion through a neighborhood. And that's really not what happens, especially in a wind driven situation like we had in Los Angeles and like that's ongoing in Los Angeles right now. Um, the wind fans the fire and essentially showers the whole area with embers. So you just picture live embers. I always tell people when they're looking at their home and kind of thinking how it would do in a wildfire, picture your home being showered with a bunch of live burning embers. What would those land on? What would ignite from those? You really want to think about it in that regard. So often embers can actually make it through the vent screens and into your attic. And as you can imagine, your attic is a very dry, cured wood, often cured materials that can burn very easily. So that's a really clear thing that we tell people to do is replace your vent screens with finer mesh vents finer mesh screen that embers can't make it through. That's a really easy thing that a homeowner or even a renter can do to make their home more resilient. Do you have vegetation or bark mulch right around your house and up against the base of your house? That's like a perfect way to bring your house down, right? Is if you have that bark mulch, it's dry, it's right up against your home, and as soon as that lights on fire, it's really easy for the siding of your house to catch on fire too. Um, People, we recommend having double pane windows that provide that insulative factor. Really having no flammable material within the first 5 feet of your house. So have a paved pathway, have a little stone landscaping, right up against your house. Those are all things that are pretty straightforward and not very expensive, really. I mean, there are some bigger things that you can do, of course, replacing your roofing, not having wooden fences attached to your house. These are all just so go outside and I would just say, look at your house and picture it just being poured on with millions of embers. And how would it do?
Yeah, and my guess is most of them would not do well, as we're
Yeah.
saying.
Yeah.
Um, and I think like you're touching on the issue. I mean, there are several issues with our paradigm when it comes to fires, but one of the things is that people tend to think of, oh, it's like, I used to live like right below the Hollywood sign. And when you'd hike up around
Mhm.
the Hollywood sign, it's just this dry, brittle brush. And there were several times where I'd be running there and I'd be like, this is just like a matchbox. Like this is, and so we think of it as the vegetation's fault that these things happen. But what we're seeing in LA, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is and this is a term I wasn't familiar with, the WUI, the wildland urban interface,
Mhm.
which is defined as the transition between unoccupied land and human development. And this really speaks to homes themselves or human infrastructure, basically, being the fuel for the fires rather than the brush and the vegetation. And so sure, we can say that the brush is not helping things, but it seems that what we're really seeing is that the homes themselves are the fuel for these fires in LA.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it's a great way that we like to frame it, is that people need to start viewing homes and infrastructure as fuels for wildfire. And so there is a tendency to blame nearby vegetation, certainly vegetation plays into it, and depending on where the fire starts, that can be how it moves into the neighborhood. But once those homes are burning, they are the fuels and they are distributing embers that are igniting other homes on fire. And it really does matter what's going on in the neighborhood. What happens at my neighbor's house is going to impact my house. So we really recommend thinking about this at the neighborhood scale. What are people doing at their own homes, but also how are they thinking about how that's going to impact each other? Because once those fires get started, we see home to home spread. And you'll often see trees that are alive and intact in neighborhoods where all the homes have burned. And there are some weird conspiracies around that we shouldn't even waste our time on. But really, what it speaks to is that the homes are actually drier and more available to burn than even the trees that are around them. So we can't always be blaming the vegetation.
Right, and you touched on something that I wanted to get into because the internet is just it can be a wild and wonderful place at times, and at times not. And so these like conspiracy theories about why the trees are still standing again speaks to a deep misunderstanding of what fire is in an
Mhm.
ecosystem, like particularly a well-balanced ecosystem. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, like when people, because I've hiked through various parts of California, whether that be the desert or up where the redwoods, up where you are, after fires, and things are lush and
Mm.
wonderful, and the redwoods are still standing, and there's this really deep misunderstanding of what a fire does. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how fire is actually an integral part of a well-balanced ecosystem.
Yeah, that's a great question and definitely one of my favorite topics. Across much of California, the ecosystems are either adapted to fire and to frequent fire, or even dependent on fire. So, depending on where you are, even here in the redwoods where I am, redwood trees, believe it or not, are really adapted to withstand fire and to take advantage of fire. And we see that across California, that fire can be a force of rejuvenation, of health, of making forests more resilient to drought and climate change and other stressors. And so there are many of us across California who actually work on restoring fire as a process and using things like prescribed fire and cultural burning and even managed wildfire to really bring this critical process back into California ecosystems. I always say that fire is as essential as rain or snow or sunlight in a lot of these places. So yeah, there's definitely a fire story to tell, and it's not as simple as just fire being bad. Humans have always had a really strong connection and a positive connection with fire.
Yeah, and I'm also curious. I mean, you mentioned redwoods, which is, of course, that's uh, a native plant or tree to that area of California. And I have a documentary about forest defense in Northern California, and one of the things that I found in my research is that only 2% of the pre-European old growth redwoods are left. And so, of course, this is inextricably linked to colonialism as well. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role that invasive species have, and oftentimes invasive species are, or monoculture plantations or things like that, are planted over clear cuts of, for instance, redwoods or something like that. Could you talk about how these then contribute to the issue of these out of control fires and how basically not all vegetation is created equal?
Yeah, that's definitely true. Different vegetation has a different relationship with fire. And so we do see different challenges with invasive species. And I think one important thing for people to think about when you think about the term invasive species, you're probably thinking of non-native invasive species, which is definitely a big component. We also have native invasive species that tend to take over and dominate places in the absence of disturbance, like fire. So, here in the North Coast, one of the issues we see with the lack of natural fire, because, like I said, a lot of these places are frequent fire ecosystems. Historically, they might have had fire every 5 to 10 years, and now they've missed 120 years of fire. So, you can imagine the compositional changes that happen with that and the changes in species and cover. And so we see a lot of native invasives that take over and grow into our prairies, take over our oak woodlands. Some of the areas that are most rich in biodiversity are the areas that have that frequent disturbance, that have fire as a core component. And so a lot of the work that I've done in Northern California has been trying to restore and maintain places that have suffered that kind of encroachment from native invasives like conifers and shrubs and just things that kind of get out of control if they're not checked by fire. um, in Southern California, there are different sets of issues and different types of invasive species. So one of the things that's been getting attention in light of these fires has been native invasive grasses, non-native invasive grasses that can increase kind of the continuity of fuels, make landscapes more easily burnable. Like the fire can spread more easily because it's burning through these annual grasses that wouldn't be there, naturally or kind of pre-colonial. So yeah, it's interesting. There are a lot of different, of course, in California, a lot of different invasive species, and their relationship with fire is variable.
And I'm curious, so I mean you were mentioning how in the North Coast, how fire has played a significant role. I'm curious how, like, if you were given the power, what would you say for LA County in terms of prescribed burns? Like, how would you deal with something like that where so much of LA County is so densely populated? Like, how would you do prescribed burns in a place like that?
Well, I think it would be important to have kind of a bigger strategic vision for like a landscape scale vision of what we're trying to accomplish. I certainly we know historically that Native people in Southern California used prescribed fire, used cultural burning. We're using fire to maintain certain parts of the landscape and to maintain certain, cultural values and keep things open and probably to protect their communities from Santa Ana wind events and other kind of catastrophic wildfires. But there are some interesting dynamics in Southern California with some of the environmental groups that are trying to protect old growth chaparral areas and think that fire is too frequent in Southern California. And then there are other, like ranchers and other groups that want to use prescribed fire to kind of, beat back some of the shrub cover and increase grass cover. And And it's a long-standing debate. I mean, to be honest, the prescribed fire in Southern California topic is fairly controversial. And I really think it would be important to take more of a landscape scale view, manage for what are our priorities. Do we want to use fire potentially to create large buffers around communities, to create fuel breaks, to maintain fuel breaks? I think it could definitely have a role in that kind of context. And there have been some efforts to bring more prescribed fire and more cultural burning back to Southern California. There's actually a newly forming prescribed burn association in Los Angeles that I'm really excited about and supporting through some of my work. Because there are community members, there are local tribes, there the LA County Fire Department who really understand the importance of using fire as a tool. And so I'm happy to see some of that getting traction down there. And I think it could be part of it, it should be in the toolbox no matter what, you know?
Absolutely. And with that, we're going to wrap up here in a minute, but I wanted to talk because you mentioned the fire department. And of course, a lot of people are pointing to the fact that LA Fire Department, thanks to the mayor and city council, received a budget cut of 17.5 million, or around 2% of the previous year's budget, while LAPD got a funding bump of $126 million, thanks to cuts that were also made to the Bureau of Street Services, homelessness services, rental support, things like that. And it just shows a total uh like a 180 of how priorities should be. And
Mhm.
something that I talk about a lot is like how we can better prepare ourselves when we know that the government is not going to help us, at least to the scale that we need it. So I'm curious, what would you say moving forward? How can we better prepare ourselves, not just individually, but like you said, like this, what my neighbor does affects me. So how can we better prepare for these things communally and mutually, understanding that the government is not going to do what is necessary?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. There was a really great piece a couple days ago in the LA Times that quoted Stephen Pine and Jack Cohen, and I recommend people check that out. It was a really great article. These are two fire experts who really understand, kind of what's going on down in Los Angeles right now and with fire in general. And one of the things that struck me about their interview was this idea that people kind of think they're going to be rescued by, like you said, by the fire department or by these fire management agencies. And there's almost a sense of like, oh, they will save us and they should save us in this kind of situation. And I think we all need to realize that the power is within us and within our neighborhoods and our communities to make the difference and to take the action. We can't, on some level, in this situation, there's nothing that anyone could have done to stop these fires. And all we can do is try to make our homes safer and to make sure that we have a plan, that we know what we're going to do if a fire like this happens in our area, that we've thought about evacuation, that we've plotted it out in our heads, that we've done those little actions at our home level and with our neighbors to make sure that our homes are more resilient and to make sure that people don't die or suffer from these fires. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The power is in our hands and the responsibility. It's time for us to take responsibility for living in these places that are prone to fire and not kind of expect someone else to take care of that problem for us.
Well, Lenya, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us, and contextualizing what's going on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me and thanks for shedding light on these important issues.
Absolutely.